Welcome to this episode of the People Dividend. I'm your host, Mike Horne, and I'm thrilled to have in our virtual studio today Andy Goram. And I want to talk all about Andy. I am, again, super excited to have him on the People Dividend podcast. And Andy has a process that helps makes things sticky. and what and I think it's a concept that we talk a lot about in organizational life, particularly among our listeners who are in human resources. We talk about making connection between people, making a stronger engagement connection for folks. And what Andy Goram does with his 7 steps is he helps organizations become stickier from the inside out. It's a place where people who work there thrive, love what they do, and where more customers stay with you and recommend you to others because they love what you do and why you do it. And he does this for so many clients. So I am delighted to have Andy Goram, the sticky guy, who's on this mission to make organizations stickier. And I hope we also get to talk about his podcast a little bit, Sticky from the Inside. Welcome, Andy. How about saying
Mike,
a few words about yourself to our audience?
Lovely. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on. Sorry about all the sticky references. That's the job of an ex-marketer. You overthink about a concept and all of a sudden it just becomes crazy. But yeah, look, I had a 27-year corporate career, which came with a marketing badge. But I spent most of my life in the organizations that I worked in trying to align sort of 3 truths, the customer truth, the brand truth, and the employee truth. And when I left corporate a few years ago, I decided I'm going to lean into that. I really enjoyed that work. And if I was going to work on my own and not in a big organization anymore, I better do something that I love. So that's what I've kind of linked into. And the sticky thing, you're 100% right. I first came across the whole concept of stickiness when I read Tipping Point years ago.
Oh, sure.
And we looked at that, I guess, from a marketing lens about, the message being sticky and resonating and something people could repeat and come back to. For me, the concept of stickiness when it came to organizations comes twofold. One, that retention piece of talent, making an organization that's sticky enough because you just don't want to leave, because you love what you do, you love who you work with, you love the things you get to do. So having an organization that's stickier. And I think it comes back to the old service profit chain as well, that if you've got a bunch of employees who are loving what they're doing and giving their best effort, that can only knock on positively for all the customer stuff that goes on as well. So for me, that whole stickiness thing comes from that perspective. And it aligns, I think, now beautifully with my own purpose, which is to try and help people have more fulfilling work lives. And if I can marry up the two, I'm living my best life, my friend.
Wow, that's super. I talk about a lot of these concepts in my recent book, The People Dividend, Leadership Strategies for Unlocking Employee Potential. And many of us have approaches to having people do their best, to bring their best to organizational life. But give us some highlights about the 7 steps to stickiness and how they help to build a thriving culture, Andy.
Okay. I mean, I think you're right. There are plenty of these sort of concepts around. And by the way, I am looking forward to talking to you on my podcast,
Oh, nice.
which surprisingly is called Sticky from the Inside. And we're going to dig into the People Dividend. Yeah, I know. One track pony, mate. That's what I am. But I think getting stuck into some of the stuff that you will talk about in the People Dividend episode that we're going to do will correlate, I think, pretty closely to some of the things around the 7 steps. But in a nutshell, the way this works for me, they can work in some chronological order, but I do think different organizations, and this is what's great about culture work, right? Different organizations are all in different places. Some would have put a lot of focus into some things and not so much into others. So you can kind of mix and match, but I think they sort of have a roundabout order. The first step, I think, is always creating and telling that engaging story, right? This is where I try and help people discover and align and tell that compelling future story of where this business is headed, which as humans, we all love a little bit of certainty. So if we can get some clarity on where we're headed, It will ease the stress and the anxiety looking over our shoulder and perhaps help us to commit to that organization a bit more and be focused on what we're doing. The next piece, number 2, is ensuring that promise matches up to reality. This is about organizational integrity for me. I'm a big fan of values and purpose, but I do not like it when organizations publicize a bunch of values that have nothing to do with what actually happens within the organization. They sound lovely, but they don't get it, right? There we go. Integrity design. Marvelous.
Integrity by Design, not my most recent book, but still available on Amazon.com. It's a couple years old now. As Marshall Goldsmith, who most of my audience would be familiar with, New York Times #1 best-selling author, ranked as the world's #1 coach. What Marshall said about this book was that it's a lesson in authenticity because if you read it, it may change your life. So I'm very aware of this concept of authenticity, Andy, and what we know is that many public corporations, at least in the U.S., integrity is one of the top values. It comes out as usually number 3 in a list of 5. And yet we know that people don't often walk the talk around that. So I'm so glad to see your second point about this connection with the first point. What's the third item on the 7 steps, Andy?
I think it comes back to equipping managers and leaders to engage with people, which is taken for granted, common sense skill. You're a human. I can communicate. I can relate. I can engage. And the reality is common sense isn't common practice. So this is all about really trying to help people with I like to call them human skills. I hate the term soft skills. It really is a trigger for me. It kind of makes it sound like it's not important as everything else. But for me, these relatory connection skills, being able to give someone focus and scope, stretch and challenge, coach and mentor, all these things I think are really, really important. So that step is all about really understanding what it takes to engage with your employees, not just take the assumption that anybody can do it, because we know they can't.
Well, and that requires some connection. I mean, for managers to think about that, to embody that. Because without purpose and connection, which I sort of think about the first 2 steps, this third step, this integration doesn't happen. What happens in step 4?
Well, in step 4, I think it's about listening. The way you just talked, I just started to think about that iceberg model and all the behavior that we see on top, but what do we really know underneath? And I think that connection starts with lowering the water level and understanding more about somebody. And a lot of that comes from listening. And there are lots of organizations that are pretty good at telling, not so great at listening. And I think one of the critical parts about actually establishing an employee voice is it's dead easy to feed back and respond to people who make suggestions that are in line with strategy. And it's dead easy to do that. It's harder to go back to someone and say, thanks for that idea, but we're not going to do it. But let me tell you why. But that's just as important, if not more important. That opens up the whole communication stuff, right?
And let's go on to the next point. Let's go on to step 5.
Okay, well, I think 5 and 6 interchangeable in terms of their order, maybe. Okay, but we'll talk about 5, and this is back to my marketing roots. This is about consistent communication. If you've got a mission and a vision and you've got values and behaviors and you're showing what's important in that business, you have to make sure that that is something that is constantly and consistently talked about, not just in newsletters and everything else, but in the major topics that are discussed. I've worked in business with a lot of operations, and people can easily go into a shop or a site or a venue, and the first thing I want to talk about is the results and what have you done. And actually what we want to do is go in and talk about the things that we say matter culturally in a business and make those the first things that we talk about and constantly refer to these things. Catch the stars of people who are delivering the right behaviors and the right things that you want. Accentuate those things, but also be honest enough to sort of say, where we're a little bit behind progress and where we need some focus. So for me, that's what that step is about. Really being clear about what's important to your organization and then being relentless in the pursuit of it through good comms.
Relentless in that pursuit. I like that word. I mean, I used to think about the training I used to do with a company called Synectics. And the approaches were about being relentlessly open-minded in terms of helping to spark innovation within an organization. So like you, I mean, soft skills is a trigger word for me. I don't see any of the things that you've described in this first list of, we're inching towards 6, that infer of anything soft. I mean, this is
No.
results and action oriented. Let's talk about six.
Okay, I love Six. I was inspired by I'm sure we've all seen that horrible grainy video on the side of some festival, the shirtless dancing guy. But that is probably the best 2.5 minutes of video I've seen in years and years and years and years. And it's all about finding your first followers. Because I think for any culture change initiative to survive, you've got to go where I call go where the sunshine is. Too many organizations where they're trying to build momentum will say to themselves, all those naysayers, all those negative Nellies, we got to go there. If we can convince them, this thing will work. And the reality is that is not how momentum works. As a marketer, I go back to the law of diffusion of innovation and the bell curve that we sort of see. And what you need to get to is those innovators and early adopters, the guys who are waiting for this cultural change stuff, the guys who are desperate for this stuff, because they are the ones who are going to bring energy and effort and prove the benefit of doing this stuff works. I'm always a big believer, Mike, that winning needs witnesses. And these guys will be providing the evidence for the early majority and the late majority to eventually get on board. So step 6 is all about finding those first followers. The guys who want to do this are going to help you tell the story and gain some momentum.
Wow, that's terrific. And then what's the penultimate step?
It's a bit of a cliched piece. It is stick with it, because culture change isn't a one and done. And I think this is where businesses often fail. They get up on stage, make some big announcements, chuck a few things about and think, right, culture's done. Let's get back to the numbers. And the reality is it's like a garden. It's a constant tending. You got to nurture it. Some days you got to give a bit more focus over here. Some days you've got to get a bit more focus over here, but your intention is to consistently keep it going so that it flourishes. And that's my 7 steps, Mike. That's how I approach culture change with clients.
Well, that's great. And we'll have in our show notes links about how to get in touch with Andy and the great work he does. But Andy, how are you, these 7 steps to stickiness, how do people access that from you? Do you do that through speaking? Do you do that through consultation? Do you do that through coaching, or some variety or combination of those things?
It's a combo, my friend. I think it has to be nowadays. Whether it's a speaking or doing the Sticky from the Inside podcast or consulting with clients or tapping people up on LinkedIn, wherever the conversation needs to happen, I will have that conversation. I absolutely love this stuff. And if I can find little differences, changes that make a big difference in how businesses operate or how people feel within inside them, then I will be there, my friend. Wherever that conversation is, I will hunt it down.
And why is employee retention so important today, Andy Goram?
I just think I think it's similar in the US, right? But certainly in the UK, the labor market has changed. And we know we've got a massive generational shift. It's leaving a big skills gap, a big experience gap. And it's not as easy to go and just hire a bunch more people. I mean, we had the budget yesterday, and the increase in minimum wage, it's just not a cost-effective strategy for most organizations to keep hiring. Retention is definitely the new recruitment. And I think with the levels of engagement that we have in the UK, we've got so much potential, so much work to do. You guys, I think the latest numbers, your engagement stats were about, 33%, I think, of the US workforce is engaged. In the UK, it's about 16%, right?
Oh my goodness, that's quite a difference.
Yeah, but what's interesting is the number of disengaged between the US and the UK, exactly the same, 16%. Mm-hmm. So we have so much potential, and I think retention is the secret to unlocking some real latent power that's just sitting, lying dormant in so many employees, just turning up to work, not giving their best ideas or effort because they've never been engaged and never been asked for them.
And one thing that I'm hopeful our listeners will do is to turn to the People Dividend, not the podcast that Andy and I are on today, but the book, The People Dividend, Leadership Strategies for Unlocking Employee Potential, because it conveys a sense of dignity, kindness, and respect as the elements for the modern workplace in the era of AI, with the new generations, Alpha, coming along, I mean, eventually, we will need, and at least in the United States, the advent of the 4-day work week, the continuing growth, I mean, to your point about minimum wage, the continuing growth of the gig economy, people having multiple ways in which they find income. All of these will require what I refer to as a return to a set of humanistic values. And the People Dividend book is essentially a guide to making that happen. And I think that with all of the similarities that we have in your stickiness approach and the People Dividend, I'd encourage our audience to, go out, look at these resources, pick up, for example, a copy of the People Dividend, and think about what is the relationship to building these kinds of engaging cultures Andy proposes.
I just think we're kindred spirits, Mike. I think we believe much of the same stuff. I just think when COVID came in the UK, we had this bow wave of humanity that came through in business. People were looking out for each other. People were really checking in and making sure things were okay and people were set up properly. It's just beginning to feel to me like, well, that's finished with now, and we're going back to the bad old ways. I don't want us to lose the opportunity that horrible event actually presented us. I think respect, dignity, kindness, these are fundamental behaviors that have a strong place in business. And I think businesses, customers, and the people that work in those businesses will be better off if we see more of those things authentically living and breathing in businesses today.
Yeah, it's odd how the world changes. I once worked for a telecom company. That's what they were called back in the day, a telecommunications company. And this was at the dawn, really, of more sophisticated internet networking. And this company would give us fully furnished offices and pay us to stay at home. Because they claimed a greater productivity with what was then called telework.
Wow.
It's interesting, and now you see a lot of people like thumping their chest, and everybody's got to be back at work. And this is true for some, not true for others. And we can get into all kinds of segmentation about what work is, essential workers, people who can work, all that kind of stuff. But it's so wonderful. And Andy Goram's no stranger to this business. As a volunteer for Engage for Success, the UK's leading voice of employee engagement, he's also, in addition to being the host of Sticky from the Inside podcast, he's also co-host of the long-running Engage for Success radio show. Can you say some things about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, maybe 11 years or so ago, the government commissioned a white paper on what's this engagement thing? Is it any good? Is it something we should pay interest to? And David McLeod wrote that paper, presented the evidence, and as a result, a volunteer organisation, Engage for Success, sprung up with the help of David and Nita Clark. And during COVID, I discovered these guys, and they'd been going for maybe 8 years at that point. I had not seen them before whilst I was in corporate. And they do an awful lot of work, thought leadership, networking groups, evidence production, research into the world of thriving at work. And I started in there as a volunteer in the Volunteers Hub, which I guess is engaging the engagers. And we ran an event where I hosted a discussion group, and David said to me afterwards, that was pretty slick, Andy. Do you fancy helping out Joe Moffat and Joe Dodds host the radio show? And I've been doing that for over 2 years now, which is fantastic. Get to speak to some amazing people around the globe about all these sorts of topics, and I can never get enough of that.
That's great. We've been in conversation today with Andy Goram, who is head of BizJuicer Consulting, which you can find at bizjuicer.com. And we'll have more ways to get in touch with Andy in today's show notes. But Andy, as we wrap up, and when you look up at Andy, he's not to be confused with that Scottish football player. But
I disappoint people all over the world when I show up and he's not there. Mike, I can't tell you.
That's the first thought when I saw Andy Goram. So we'll have all that in the show notes. But in these, we're into 2025, 2025. Um, what's your advice or guidance for if you were to offer one piece of advice or guidance to our listeners on engagement? What would it be?
I would just say don't assume that you know what's going on with your people. Take the time to listen, discuss, find out, and then take some affirmative action. And just be more human. That's all it takes.
Nice. I like that. Be more human. So let's end it there. Until the next episode of the People Dividend, stay well.